You're all set, Dale.
Okay, thanks, Dale. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dale Mackinac. I'm the director of Northwood University's Freedom Seminar. And welcome to tonight's event on climate, energy, and policy. And we have with us tonight the authors of a very important report called Grading the Grid, in which they are looking at all types of energy that we're going to need to fuel our economy going forward. And we're going to be talking about the public policy effects on these various types of energy and their development. So the authors are Jason Hayes and Tim Nash. So let me start by introducing Tim Nash, somebody Northwood students should definitely know. He's been at Northwood since 1980. And nobody, I think, has done more to make Northwood the kind of special place it is than Tim Nash, starting as a student where he was an RA and then becoming a faculty member, the dean of the graduate school. Ultimately, he has become the president of the Mackinac Center at Northwood University, which is a highly regarded public policy think tank and is published frequently and produces reports that are important for policymakers, including the competitiveness report, which comes out periodically and grades states and their competitiveness, and has been very influential in public policy in Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia. He is the editor, along with me, of your text When We Are Free, which many of our Northwood students have in their possession, and I hope you value it highly. Anyway, Dr. Nash, it's a pleasure to have you with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
We also have with us tonight Jason Hayes. And sorry here. Well, I have lost your bio, Jason. So Jason also has a long association with Northwood University, but his major role is as the director of environmental research at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. And Jason is another influential policymaker. He's testified before Congress. He's been published in the Wall Street Journal and many other places. And he's a very influential voice at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, which, as you may know, is one of the most influential state-level public policy think tanks in the entire country. So I am glad to have you with us also, Jason. Thank you very much. And I will invite Jason to speak first for a few minutes. And Jason, if you would come up here, please. Let's welcome Jason Hayes.
All right. Good afternoon, or it's evening now, I suppose. But thanks for coming. Thanks to Tim and Dale and staff at Northwood for putting on the Freedom Seminar. And I was asked here today to do the grid portion of research that Tim and I work on. So Tim and I put together this paper, Grading the Grid, which was reviewing, or a comprehensive review of power sources and grid stability. And so you would ask, like, why would you grade the grid? Like, what's the purpose of that? Well, most of us understand that energy is essential to human flourishing. We need it every second of our lives. We use it for the lights, to stream the video that we're streaming across the country and across the world, to light our computers. All of these things, we use it in every aspect of our life. So energy is essential to human flourishing. Another reason that Tim and I asked about, why should we do this, is because, well, nobody had done this kind of study before. There are other studies that have been done that are kind of similar, but they're shorter. They look at less. They don't have as broad a group of metrics that they use to kind of gauge which energy source is important. And so we said, this is the kind of stuff that should be done. Also, we saw that something's just not right about the whole energy story that we're hearing. So we're hearing things like pro-renewable and decarbonization and net zero mandates. We're hearing from the media, all of the marketing is rampant. We're told that green energy is affordable and reliable. It's going to replace the energy systems and sources that we've used for decades or even over a century. We're told that this is happening. We see states, the entire country, we see other countries around the planet implementing these net zero plans, these decarbonization goals. And then at the same time, what we see is that our energy systems are becoming increasingly unstable, and the price for electricity is going up. And so when Tim and I were discussing this, we're like, something's not right. We're not getting the whole story. So we decided we were going to try to tell some of this story with our report. And so what we'll talk about here tonight is these 5 points. We understand energy is essential to human flourishing. We hear that we have to transition the grid, but there's a challenge that we're facing. We need reliable, affordable, and clean energy. How are we going to meet that? So Tim and I set up this report to look at 8 major energy sources and use a 5-part metric to do our work. And then at the end of our report, we came out with some policy suggestions. Where do we go from here, kind of thing. So there's a whole bunch of people that are looking at how is energy important in our lives. And so one example, Lars Chernichow and William Hayden Smith wrote in their book, The Unpopular Truth. They use this analogy that electricity is to modern civilization as blood is to the human body. So we know that if we remove electricity from our current situation, pretty much everything shuts down, just the same as your body would if you removed the blood. It's that important to everything that we do. And the people that don't have access to abundant, affordable, reliable, modern energy services live in a state that's known in the biz as energy poverty. So there's 759 million people across the planet 2 years ago that didn't have access to reliable electricity. They may have access to electricity, but it's on for a few hours and then it's off for a couple days. It's on for a day, it's off for a few days. So that's the system they live in. There's 2.6 billion people around the planet that are forced to use dangerous and inefficient cooking systems. You can see like these ladies here are cooking on charcoal fires. A lot of people use dried animal dung to cook their food. And they do it usually in interior settings, so they're breathing in the dust and the smoke and all that sort of stuff. They have a lot of health issues associated with this. And so there's problems when you live in a state of energy poverty. Human health and well-being rely or are related to this idea. If you have reliable energy, it helps to promote human flourishing. Since the Industrial Revolution, our improved life expectancy is attributed to that easier access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy. We have better healthcare, better medicine, better food production. We live longer lives. We have better air quality, cleaner water, and we eat a healthier diet if we're in a country that has this abundant, affordable, reliable energy. The people that don't have that live in that state of energy policy. They don't have that benefit. And so we know that for our lives, we live actually very blessed lives. We're very comfortable. We have a lot of food. When we turn the thermostat, our heat comes on. We have all of these things, and we've had it in increasing quantities for decades, even over a century. We've been getting better and better at this. And yet we're told that we have to transition the grid. The things that we know work, we're told are dangerous and dirty and destructive, and we need to get rid of them, stop using them, and transition to other options. So first off, you got to wonder, what is the grid or the bulk power supply system? Well, the grid and the transmission system that we rely on is an interconnected group of power lines and infrastructure that takes electric power and moves it from generation stations like nuclear plants, coal plants, natural gas, wind, and solar, and then moves it through high tension power lines, high voltage power lines to substations. And then from the substations, it gets moved along distribution lines to our homes and our businesses. So this is the bulk power system that we rely on to get the energy that we use to charge our phones, to run our computers and all that sort of thing. And so we know that system works. So we would ask, well, if it ain't broke, it works, why would we transition? What's the purpose of that? Well, we hear from elected officials, scientists, academics, that sort of thing, things like this, where President Biden said that climate change is an existential threat. It's driven by the emissions of CO2 and greenhouse gases, right? It is, according to President Biden, the ultimate threat to humanity. Okay, and we hear that and we think the ultimate threat, hang on, that doesn't pass the smell test. Like climate change is a bigger threat than nuclear war. It's a bigger threat than, pick a disease, cancer, anything like that. It's a bigger threat than some of the other issues we face. Even the scientists out there admit, while they may agree that climate change is a concern, they still will recognize that there are benefits associated with CO2. So a lot of the time you won't hear that. You won't hear it in the media. You won't hear it from a lot of elected officials that, wow, there could be good coming from carbon dioxide. How does that work, right? Okay, well, on the NASA website, if you look, you Google NASA global greening, you'll get stories like this. CO2 is actually a fertilizer, not a pollutant. Well, who would have thought that, right? A quarter to half of the Earth's vegetated land has shown significant greening. More green leafy biomass is being produced as a result of, what did they say? Carbon dioxide fertilization. When was the last time you heard a term like that? Carbon dioxide is usually vilified or pilloried as carbon pollution, right? No, it's actually fertilization. So what's next? As our CO2 emissions have gone up over the past 100 years, deaths related to climate or extreme weather have gone down by 98%. So how does that work? If it's the ultimate threat to humanity, how is it that 98% fewer climate deaths have happened? If you plug the emissions that are supposed to be taken out of the atmosphere as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate legislation that President Biden passed, if you plug that into the climate models used for all major UN reports, global temperatures, according to those models, will be reduced by 10,000th of a degree Fahrenheit. If CO2 induced climate change is the ultimate threat facing humanity, is the Inflation Reduction Act even close to enough? No, I would argue it's not. So maybe there's something wrong. Again, it's not passing the smell test. We're told we have to transition our grid, right? Okay, we're building more wind and solar. We're trying to make that happen. But demand for energy is growing so fast because of things like we're transitioning to EVs, we're building new data centers, we're using AI and all these sorts of things. Demand for electricity and energy overall is growing so fast that all of the wind and solar that we're building isn't even keeping up with demand, like our growing demand. So where are we going to get all the rest of the energy that we need? Right now, I'll tell you, as of 2023, 92% of the energy that we use comes either from nuclear or fossil fuels. The vast majority of it comes from fossil fuels. So if only 9% is coming from renewables, and look, a good sized chunk of that is biofuels. We're still logging our forests to produce wood that we can burn to make energy or to heat homes and do all that sort of thing. We're still logging our forests to do this. Okay, only 1% of our energy comes from solar and 1.6 comes from wind. Not even 3% of total primary energy demand is coming from wind and solar, despite the fact that we're told we have to transition. Okay, if you look at, well, the United States is trying to do its part, right? So from 2005, when our CO2 emissions peaked in this country, to today, we've lowered our CO2 emissions by 17%, according to the EPA and International Energy Agency, other groups like that. So US is trying to do its part, right? We're cutting our CO2 emissions. But if you look at other countries, specifically India and China, they're both ramping up their CO2 emissions at insane rates, right? China, since 1990, has increased its CO2 emissions by 300%. So if you take just China by itself and then compare it to all of the rest of the developed world, China's CO2 emissions outdo the rest of the developed world. So now, of course, we still have higher per capita rates because we use a lot of energy here in the United States, but we are cutting. So the reason that we're lowering our CO2 is because of a fossil fuel, natural gas. 2/3 of that 17% statistic I said to you, 2/3 comes from the fact that we've switched from older coal-fired technologies that were designed in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and we've switched to 21st or 2000 or 21st century technologies using natural gas. So gas produces about half as much CO2 when we burn it, but also we're building much newer, more efficient technologies and using that. So that's the primary reason why we've been able to cut our CO2 emissions. Then you look across the pond at other countries that are also doing their part. What happens? Well, Great Britain now has the highest industrial electricity prices on the planet because they've tried to impose their net zero mandates. So their electricity prices went up 124% in the last 5 years. Great Britain's industry now pays electricity rates that are 4 times higher than what industry in the United States pays. So we have a challenge. What are we going to do about this, right? We still need reliable, affordable, and clean energy. We also want other aspects to our energy. We want adequate, we need enough energy. We want dispatchable, which means when we need it, it's there. When we flick the light switch, we get light, whether the sun's shining or the wind's blowing or not. That's what dispatchable is, and secure. Sometimes our energy sources come from countries that aren't really friendly toward us. So if we had problems with them, we would want a different source to be able to supply. So that's what adequate, dispatchable, and secure refers to. But our primary three that we're worried about are affordable, reliable, and clean. Those are the ones that we want, okay? If you look at the people whose job it is to make sure North America's electric grid works, there's a guy named Jim Robb. He's the CEO of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. Jim's job is to make sure the North American electric grid runs stably and reliably. Well, Jim is telling us that the disorderly or the rushed retirement of older generation is happening way too quickly. We're going too fast on this. And the electric sector, says Jim, needs to find ways to balance reliability, affordability, and environmental impact. So there's those three things again: reliable, affordable, and clean, right? Okay. Jim's colleague, who works at a place called the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO for short, that's his job, is to make sure the grid that powers Michigan, our state, is running reliably and efficiently. So he's a regional grid operator. John wrote a report, MISO published this. It's called The Response to the Reliability Imperative, this February. Okay, and in his opening statement, he said the transition that is underway to get to a decarbonized end state is posing material adverse challenges to electric reliability. Our electric grid is no longer reliable the way that it used to be. Now, John's colleague, also another fellow from MISO, Todd Ramey, who's one of their senior vice presidents, was testifying before the House Committee on Energy and Commerce last year. And he said, weather-dependent generators, which means solar and wind, are increasing reliability risks. So again, we're starting to see these problems as we try to transition. We're so focused on clean that we're forgetting or ignoring affordable and reliable. And that's causing problems for our grid. So when Tim and I were looking at this, we said, okay, how do we start to find a way through these problems? Because these are real problems. If the grid operators are telling us that reliability is an issue, maybe we should pay attention to this. So Tim and I came up with this 8 energy sectors and a 5-point metric. So we looked at gas, nuclear, coal, hydro, petroleum, geothermal, solar, and wind. And then our 5-point metric was, we look at the capacity and reliability of each energy source. Can they actually produce the electricity or the energy that we need? What's the environmental and human impact of using them? How much do they cost? Is there enough new technology coming out that's going to be able to meet growing demand and produce this electricity, this energy more efficiently? And then what's the market feasibility that these sources are even going to be used? If we're looking at free markets, what are the incentives to use these energy sources? And so our 8 sources were natural gas. We gave natural gas an A because highly reliable, affordable, and clean. It's domestically produced and produces a lot of good jobs, good paying careers. Okay. It fixes wind and solar's intermittency problems as well. So if you notice, the sun does not shine 24/7, the wind does not blow 24/7. So what happens if you're relying on wind and solar is you see your energy production looking like this, spikes and valleys. So the only energy source that we have right now that reliably fills in those gaps, when there's a valley, natural gas can come in really quickly. It's called ramping. You can ramp up a natural gas turbine quickly, and it can fill in that gap and smooth out the supply line. Okay. Now, some of the challenges associated with gas, it does produce CO2 when you burn it. So the net zero, more extreme net zero policies that are being implemented are starting to impact on gas's ability to be a major energy source. And then also we noted that when we're using gas, we rely on just-in-time shipments to come through pipelines to get to the turbine when we need it. So if we had on-site storage, gas could be even more reliable, which would be a good thing. Nuclear, we gave a B+ because it is our safest form of generation. It's our most reliable form of generation. It's emissions-free. It's domestically produced, and we have lots of supplies here, whether in the form of uranium, in northern mines, or even in spent fuel that's sitting beside all of our nuclear reactors. If we reprocess that fuel, we would have hundreds of years of energy right there. There are some of the cons, high initial costs to build it. Once it's up and running, however, it's cheap to run, and it'll run for 60, 80, even 100 years, so you can spread your costs out over a very long time. The other problem that nuclear suffers from right now is that the public does not have a very good understanding of its safety and reliability record. So that's on the nuclear industry to make sure that people understand that better.
Jason, are you taking questions during your presentation?
I can, if people are really itching, I can do it.
I just wanted to address the filling in the gaps idea.
Sure.
So is that the role that you think gas will play in our system, is kind of fire it up when we need it and let it go idle when we don't? And is there efficiency cost to that?
So right now, gas, if you remember that slide that I showed, that's primary energy consumption. Gas right now, I think, is 36% of our total energy supply. So gas is doing the heavy lifting as a baseload energy source, and it's also doing that peaking supply as well. So gas is going to be one of those major energy supplies no matter what we do. So it'll fill in both gaps there. So, But for coal, again, highly reliable on-site storage. When you're looking at a coal plant, you can store 2 to 3 months worth of coal use on-site. So if you have an interruption in shipping, it's not a huge big deal because you can still just keep getting coal from the yard. It's affordable, domestically produced, again, good paying jobs. The challenge for coal is that it produces more CO2 than other other energy sources. And so what's happening is the net zero demands are really crimping coal style, so to speak. We're in the Western nations really cutting back on coal use, but in Asian nations like China, there's extremely rapid growth. So coal is seeing a spike on the other side of the planet. Okay, petroleum, very small role in energy, so we gave it a C minus. It's domestically produced, good paying jobs, but it's a niche market. Really, only certain places like in Hawaii use it. And then also, as you burn oil, you get CO2 emissions. So geothermal, very limited role, even less so than oil, but it shows promise. While it's geographically limited, primarily only in the Western states, there's opportunities, new technologies that are coming out, enhanced geothermal. There's groups like Google is doing a cooperative effort with an energy firm called Fervo. They're using enhanced geothermal. They're using fracking techniques to drill deeper and faster to get to geothermal energy and basically release it faster and cheaper. So if they can make that work, there's potential for it. But right now, it's still a very limited source. Hydro, very reliable, emissions-free, but it can be expensive to build. And then there's also a lot of environmental pushback against it right now. If you look, especially in states like Washington and Oregon, environmental groups are pushing really hard to get dams removed. And so it's actually highly unlikely that new dams would be permitted. And that's why we gave hydro a lower grade down to a B minus. The last two, wind and solar, kind of work together. Tim and I gave them Fs. Now, they don't produce CO2 when they're generating electricity. Their cost has come down quite a bit because we're building more of them, but they're still expensive because they rely heavily on subsidies, and they also impose high costs on the grid. So that intermittency that I talked about before is an issue because it's going up and down and up and down. So you always have to have backup for them. In most cases, it's natural gas. In newer cases, what we're trying to do is build battery backups, but batteries suffer from a lot of the same environmental issues and even social and human rights issues that I'll talk about here in a second. So wind and solar and batteries are marketed as green, but there are growing environmental impacts associated with them as we build more of them. The mining that you need for the metals, the rare earth minerals and all that sort of thing, land use, wildlife impacts, and increasingly, as we're getting to the end of the first round of the life cycle of wind and solar panels, we're starting to have a lot of disposal and recycling issues. So e-waste and that sort of stuff, and we're seeing the same sort of thing from batteries. Some of the human rights concerns that are associated with solar and batteries are that there's 2 to 3 million Uyghurs, the Muslim minority population in the Xinjiang region of China, that has been literally enslaved by the Chinese government, and they're forced to build polysilicon and EV components. So this is widely known. It's published in the New York Times. The U.S. federal government has published on this as well. Forced labor, as they call it, is a growing concern for solar and then also EV batteries and that sort of thing, the batteries that are used to back up some of these sources. You also have issues related to mining when it comes to batteries. The battery backups require something called cobalt, a mineral that's mined primarily in a country called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There are serious issues. If you read one book about it, it's called Cobalt Red. describes how people live on like $2 to $3 a day doing grueling backbreaking work in unsafe conditions, not only adults, but there are a lot of women and children that are also forced to mine. And so you have 7 or 8-year-old kids doing these mining jobs to get cobalt so that we can have batteries for our EVs and utilities. So when you look at this 3-part test that I was talking about, affordable, reliable, and clean, our grid is failing this energy challenge. The energy transition is making our energy more expensive, less reliable, and as I just showed with the wind and solar part, it's still not clean. So we're not meeting those tests. And when we consider these problems, if we're going backwards to less reliable, more expensive, and unclean energy sources, going backward is not a good way to go forward. Net zero decarbonization mandates are putting Western societies, developed nations, at risk of catastrophic grid collapse. And they're forcing developing nations to slow their advancement into the same sort of lifestyle that we all enjoy. So if we deal with catastrophic grid collapses, this is the kind of thing that you get. So we saw this in February 2021 in Texas. The Texas Comptroller's website says over 210 people died as a result of the blackouts that happened in Texas. Texas government is publishing that stat. 210 people died either of hypothermia or carbon monoxide poisoning or something like that. This is a picture of what happened after Hurricane Katrina came in. There was a hospital called Memorial Baptist Hospital. At the end of 5 days without power to that hospital, doctors were in a position where they felt that they needed to euthanize patients. So our veneer of civilization is very thin, and it's not hard to disrupt it. When we don't have reliable, affordable, consistent energy, bad things can happen. And so some people may say, well, it's kind of shocking. It's a little bit harsh. Well, good, because we should be shocked by the idea that our grid could be impacted by bad energy decisions. So we should be thinking about these kind of things. So the policy suggestions that we got out of our paper is we need to go back to reprioritize affordable and reliable. That should be job number 1 for our utilities. Natural gas, we should be building more of it. And we should be including on-site storage so that it's even more reliable than it already is. Nuclear, we should be building more of it. Base load and small modular nukes, because emissions free, completely reliable, and once we get it up and running, very affordable. But more than anything, we need to be demanding that our elected officials, our utility officials have or be willing to have honest discussions about the full costs of our energy choices. So we should be having real discussions about the environmental impacts associated with all kinds of energy, not just fossil fuels. We should be willing to admit that there are environmental costs associated with others' energy choices as well. We need to recognize the human rights implications. It is not okay for us to pat ourselves on the back and tell ourselves we're green and clean when our green and clean choices require a 7-year-old kid to work unprotected in toxic waste in the Congo. We should be having those kind of honest discussions. We talk about the social cost of carbon. Okay, fair enough. What are the social cost of blackouts? What are the opportunity costs of unreliable energy options? Those are the kind of discussions that we need to be having. And I'm happy to answer questions. I think right now I have to turn it over to Tim, but I'm happy to answer questions whenever the Q&A comes up. So, yep. Are we good?
Well,
you tell me.
Yeah, why don't we have Tim's presentation, and then we'll have the Q&A.
Okay.
At the
Yeah,
end.
that'd be great.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be back here at Northwood and to be with all of you. Welcome to the Mackinac Center. For those of you that don't know much about the Mackinac Center and you like football, the Mackinac family that gave us the original gift to establish the Mackinac Center comes from the great state of Texas, from Houston. And the Mackinac family is the family that brought football back to the state of Texas and Houston with the Houston Texans. They're big in the energy business and certainly a major player in the U.S. National Football League. What I would also like to do is to thank Dale. One of the best hires I ever made many, many years ago was to hire Dr. Mackinac. He's almost fresh out of his doctoral program at Cornell, and he's just done a great job. So congrats, Dale, for all the great work you do here at Northwood. I think it's important to piggyback on my dear friend Jason Hayes's talk. He's, as Dale noted, he's one of this country's gems as it relates to environmental understanding, environmental research, public policy in the area of environmental research. And Jason and I have worked on a couple of papers together, one being Grading the Grid. We have a second one coming out in the next week or so, entitled The Pros and Cons of Electric Vehicles. And I think what's important for all of us to understand is that, you know, an electric vehicle, an electric automobile is not a new thing. If we put ourselves back in the United States at the turn of the 20th century, so early 1900s, what we forget about is there were about 120 different manufacturers producing automobiles. Names like Pontiac, names like Studebaker, and we had 10 different electric car companies that were competing against what was perceived to be the major winner in the early days of the U.S. auto industry, Henry Ford. But most people don't realize that the market rejected electric vehicles for a reason. And so if we look to the future and we think about where we are today, there's a lot that I think needs to be said regarding why we don't have more electric vehicles. And we don't have more electric vehicles, again, because the market has rejected electric vehicles. The market has rejected electric vehicles because they're very costly. They're about 20 to 25% more expensive than ICE or internal combustion engines. When it comes to charging vehicles, having a convenient place to charge a vehicle is problematic. Okay. How's this on? Okay, so the electric vehicle is about 20 to 25% more expensive. When it comes to convenience of charging, there are still two issues that we have to take a look at. Where can you have your vehicle charged? People that really enjoy their electric vehicles, and there are a lot of them. So the two of us are not saying that we ought not have electric vehicles. I would guess someday my better half, Pam, over there, and myself, we will probably own an electric vehicle. There's a lot of benefits to electric vehicles. However, right now, if you want an electric vehicle, you're talking about a vehicle, for the most part, most of the owners have the ability to charge that vehicle at their home. That means roughly 65% of Americans. 35% that own an electric vehicle and live in an apartment or a townhouse find charging to be a problem because vehicles do not charge quickly. We're not talking about 10 or 15 minutes to gas up your automobile and be on your way. We're talking about hours in many cases to charge your electric vehicle. So the point with regard to electric vehicles, I'd like to piggyback on what Jason said regarding the grid and point out that maybe what we need to do is let the market answer the question regarding electric vehicles, and that the introduction should be a lot slower than
what certain politicians have asked for and or what certain automobile companies had at least originally targeted for just 3 or 4 years ago. First of all, if you look at the grid and the wonderful presentation by Mr. Hayes, the only other thing I would add to that particular point is that there are a couple of major studies out that warn us that right now, 80% of all the equipment to repair or build the next generation of our power grid comes from outside of the United States. And a lot of that comes from China. And is that something that we want to rely on moving forward? And it's not just in an economic sense, it's in a geopolitical, God forbid, military sense that we have to ask that question. I'm not giving you the answer, I'm simply asking that as a question. If you look at or you think about electric vehicles, blackouts, major problems for electric vehicles, for even whether you have a charging system in your home or you have to go someplace else. If you consider the fact that floods have been very problematic, and we have a number of issues with floods and electric vehicles right now taking place in the hurricane-ravaged states of the Southwest in the United States. If you look at fires and electric vehicles, there are a lot of problems with just salt water creating certain types of fires. But 2 years ago in the summer, Austin, Texas, our son and daughter-in-law used to live there with their family, and a vehicle caught on fire in Austin, and the fire department estimated that it took 40,000 gallons of water to put the electric vehicle out, or 40 times what it would take in terms of water to put out a fully engulfed ice engine vehicle that was on fire. So there are a lot of interesting issues or variables that come into consideration. When it comes to, again, charging, it's not just that it takes a lot longer, and there are very few fast charge or rapid charge stations that exist in the United States today and or that are compatible with the right vehicles. If you're a Tesla, you have a much better system. But most of the other automobile producers with their electric vehicles have not caught up in that regard. And then the second factor is that when it's extremely cold, electric vehicles do not perform well. They don't hold their charge well. And this is a reduction of anywhere from a 10 to 30% efficiency loss in the winter. And once it's above 86 degrees in the summer, the higher heat actually reduces the charge and the efficiency of an electric vehicle. Most people that look at or want to own, that purchase electric vehicles, are individuals, ladies and gentlemen, that are looking for the vehicle that they can drive to work and from work, that they use short distances, 50 miles or less. Even electric vehicle owners are not as convinced about the long road of or a trip of 2 hours or beyond 100 miles. It's still a very challenging, almost leap of faith for a number of Americans when it comes to purchasing and then using electric vehicles. The other factor as we look at electric vehicles, you're starting to see, and if you've looked at some of these inflation variables, and this is where the Biden administration, it's not monetary inflation that I'm about to talk about, but it really comes into play as it relates to insurance. And one of the reasons why inflation so far in a little over 3.5 years of President Biden's administration, it's up about 20%. And a big chunk of that is excess government monetary policy related to excess government spending, which is not the topic for today. But then you ask yourself the question, why is it that automobile insurance over that exact same period is up over 50%? One of the reasons is certainly floods, flood insurance, the cost of replacing vehicles in difficult areas. But a second factor, whether you realize it or not, an electric vehicle is about 33% heavier than an internal combustion engine. The battery pack on an electric vehicle is extremely heavy relative to the general mass or the general weight of an internal combustion engine. So could you imagine going down the highway and you get hit by an F1 pickup truck? Not something you'd like to have happen, period, but certainly if you were in a smaller economy vehicle. And then imagine if it was an F-150 Lightning truck, which means it's an electric vehicle with a large battery pack in place of the engine. And again, it's 2.5 to 3,000 pounds heavier than the normal F-150 pickup truck. The damage that is done both to humans and other vehicles is problematic, and we're just getting a grip on that as a factor relative to the purchasing of automobiles. As it relates to roads, there's a lot more damage being done to roads with heavier vehicles. There have actually been studies out where cities are now looking at, and private companies that own parking garages are saying, all right, let's start to extrapolate to the future. When we build a new parking garage, or we shore up an existing parking garage, or we're looking at our existing parking garage, what is the potential that, for example, 3 years ago, Mary Barra said by 2035, 100% of all new vehicles sold in the United States by General Motors would be electric vehicles. All of a sudden, you're looking at within 20 years, can the existing parking garages handle that additional weight? Same vehicle takes up the same space, but it's 33% higher. Will there be structural issues with things like garages? And that means a dramatic change in not just the infrastructure, our small roads, our highways, our bridges, but it also means things like parking garages and structures of that nature will be in jeopardy. The other thing that you need to note is that if you analyze the annual report on the condition of highways in the United States, our roads are subpar versus many European countries, and even the new roads being built in China. Heavier weighted electric vehicles will add to the deterioration and the decline of those. And again, we're not talking a lot about that as we push for electric vehicles moving forward. And again, we're not anti-electric vehicle. We're saying, is the market ready for it? Are we producing them in the right combination? And also, are there other alternatives that we might consider? If you look at, or if you consider individuals that are purchasing automobiles today, we're not selling electric vehicles at the pace we thought we would 2 years ago. So we're behind that pace to get to 100% EVs by 2035. And if you poll individuals that are looking at buying automobiles, you can look at Edmunds, you can look at Automotive News, you can look at Car and Driver. There's a number of surveys out there. We mentioned them in the study. If you're doing a research paper related to this for your Freedom Seminar paper, you can get, by the way, Grading the Grid off the McNair website, the Mackinac Center website. You can get that whole research paper downloaded for free, and it may still be on Fox News. Fox News had it on their website for quite a while. But the thing that I think is important as you look at electric vehicles is that we're trying to figure out, do people want them? And right now, recent surveys say that 50% of Americans considering an automobile today say they're not, at least at this time, considering an electric vehicle. 15% said they'll never consider an electric vehicle, and 35% of Americans say they're interested in purchasing an electric vehicle. So it's interesting. Can we meet the goals with that data? The second point that I would ask you to consider is that when you're looking at electric vehicle owners, somewhere, depending on whose studies you look at the last couple of years, between 68 and 98% of people being surveyed that are electric vehicle owners say that their second car is an ICE engine vehicle. And when they're asked in a more deep questioning fashion why, and they're saying for our longer trips, we would prefer the ICE vehicle, stop, get gasoline, continue down the road. But when you're looking at the individuals that are looking at that second vehicle, they're also simply saying they want the reliability in other situations. An additional part of these studies then asks electric vehicle owners, will you purchase another electric vehicle? And right now, 50% of electric vehicle owners that own electric vehicles are saying, we're probably not going to buy an electric vehicle as our next vehicle. And you may have heard earlier in the year a number of electric vehicle components of rental car companies delivered some bad news to EV producers by saying, look, we can't get our customers to rent electric vehicles. We give them discounts. They're not confident in their ability to find a place to charge the electric vehicle, And so they simply reduced the fleet that they had of electric vehicles. So not only is it down versus where they thought it would be, but they're not buying the electric vehicles of the future the way a number of electric vehicles were sold to rental car companies as fleet vehicles. So it's interesting for you to take a look at or to think about these types of variables relative to electric vehicles. And then probably to me, one of the most interesting variables to consider when it comes to electric vehicles is the fact that if I'm purchasing an automobile and I'm buying a used vehicle, one of the things that has always fascinated me, and I've written some pieces for Automotive News, and am just enthralled by the automobile dealer, the dealership process. I think automobile dealers are some of America's great entrepreneurs, and they just do incredible things, and keeping the automobiles of the U.S. of A. on the market, keeping them serviced. And I remember, again, when Pam said, yes, we're going to celebrate here pretty soon. She'll be shocked I remember this. In December, we'll celebrate 46 years of wedded bliss, at least for me. And I remember some of the first cars we owned. And I'm telling you, her father, I think, said, what did I let my daughter do? Because some of these cars were just, a little duct tape and little extra work. They stayed on the road. But you know what was always interesting? When you traded in that vehicle, as bad as it might have looked, and they were a lot more rust buckets back then than they are today. I'm 66 years old, and we were selling rust proofing on automobiles as an option when we bought our first new car. It's given today. Cars don't rust the way they did back then. But even if your car broke down, you could sell it for scrap, right? And so, lower income people are the ones that drive most of the used cars. And the average age of an automobile is roughly 13 years that's on the road today. And so if you're a poor person, you're a lower income person, you buy that lower cost automobile, and even if it breaks down, you might get $500 in scrap metal for it. They recycle the rubber tires, etc. Now with electric vehicles, gang, one of the real problems with electric vehicles today is the ability to salvage a battery. It's extremely costly. And there are a lot of studies out there that are now saying that the actual value of a X-year-old electric vehicle is negative. That to get rid of the vehicle, the last owner, before it collapses, before the battery's no good and can't be recycled, they have to pay to have it recycled. So it doesn't have a scrap value to it. It has zero value at that particular point. So I think it's important that you look at these issues, you look at these variables when you're talking about electric vehicles and you're looking at the next purchases. I really believe that we're pushing too hard from Washington. In certain states, we're pushing too hard to have the adoption of electric vehicles. And not only are we doing it at the expense of a strong American automobile industry producing both domestic and foreign vehicles that are ICE or internal combustion engines, but I also think we're preventing new technology from coming to the market. We have a lot of hydrogen-powered Hummers in our U.S. military. So if we have a hydrogen-powered Hummer, which is a major, it's a Jeep on steroids, and they're hydrogen-powered, we know the technology exists. Why can't we use it with regard to hydrogen and hydrogen-powered vehicles in the fleet of consumers here in the United States? Some cities have hydrogen-powered buses. Why not hydrogen cars? So it's not that the technology doesn't exist. We're saying that we don't think it may be as safe, or we want to push maybe too hard on electric vehicles. Finally, I'll give you one story and then leave it open for Q&A. One of my dear friends, I played football with him here at Northwood, his name's Ed McBrien, was an executive in the beer industry, was the president of Miller Coors North America. And when he retired from Miller Coors, he became the CEO of the largest beer distributorship in the world, the Manhattan Beverage Company out of Manhattan, New York. And they were selling, and still to this day sell, a lot of Miller Lite and other great beers. And when he took over the business, he had been the guy selling to the distributors, and now he's a distributor. And so he had the daily experience of running the day-to-day operations, making certain the trucks were getting the product delivered throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City. And he then realized that there was something he had to adhere to, and that was the pollution standards in the city of New York. Very high pollution standards. They reduce, have you reduce the tailpipe emissions more rigorously than most cities in the United States. And one of his mechanics came to him one day and he said, Ed, one of the things you got to look at is for about $4,000, we can convert all these diesel trucks to firing on natural gas. And we've got a natural gas hookup here in the shop. And he said, it'll be a lot less expensive. And he said, the pollution will be near zero. So Ed decides to have a lot of his big diesel trucks that deliver beer, the big kegs to the bars, etc., converted to natural gas. And 2 weeks later, the inspector comes to check out the trucks. And he said, I can't believe this. And he's got his gauge at the tailpipe. He said, my gauges tell me I could suck on this tailpipe and not bring in any carbon emissions into my lungs. What did you do? What's going on here? And then he pointed out to him that he had converted it to natural gas. And within a year later, the city of New York, wanting to push for electric vehicles, said you can't convert the trucks to natural gas. And so some cities have natural gas powered buses and trucks, some don't. But you realize around the world, there are about 25 million automobiles, and a lot of them in the Middle East. They're not powered by hydrogen. They're not electric. They're not gasoline. They're powered by natural gas. So there's a lot of interesting options, and it's been an honor being with you today. We'll take any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Do I get the microphone or should I just speak?
Are we recording?
Why don't you repeat their question?
Okay.
So that we can record it. Sure. So you guys talked about infrastructure in like China and other countries that kind of leads a better track record for electric vehicles. And I just want to point out that I actually didn't know this until probably a couple months ago, but the Tesla Model Y was in the world overall was the most selling car in 2023. It's less popular in the US. So do you think the answer for the US specifically for EVs is to improve that infrastructure that you said was a positive change in Asia and Europe? Do you think that's the answer moving forward? Or how would you kind of elevate the EVs to be a better solution?
I would say that companies like Tesla are doing that sort of thing on their own. They're not looking for necessarily a policy that aids them in doing that. Tesla's charging stations are the most prolific across the country. Like if you are driving around, stop at a Buc-ee's or something like that, you can always see Tesla chargers. So I would say that that's really the job of the industry, first off, not government. So government can get out of the way and make it easier for them to build the chargers if they want. But really, the thing that drives the adoption of a new technology should be the customer, not a policy or something.
Sorry, I was unspecific. I meant the road infrastructure itself, not the power infrastructure.
Oh, road infrastructure. Well, I mean, yeah. So most of the road, the way that roads are built are through taxes or through fees, like that sort of thing. So understand that as we do that kind of thing, the cost of driving is going to go up. So if we want to pay those fees, then we could say, yeah, okay, vehicle producers, any of that sort of thing, yes, you can do that, and we're okay with paying it. We're going to lead off by buying EVs or that kind of thing. I mean, additionally, also in that sense, roads are more handled by state government, federal government, and also city government. So in that sense, I would say you would elect the people that are pushing this as an option. But yeah, again, I think any of these technologies should be driven by customer demand first and foremost.
The only point that I would add is well, two things. One, the handouts that I passed out, you should have two of them. One from the publication Town Hall that Jason and I wrote, and then there's another one that's really a supplement. And a lot of my comments are bullet points from there. I would also say that when you look at grading the grid and then the EV paper that we have coming out, those will be available for you shortly. The thing that is important, and again, it involves having a lot of imagination and to understand that this is the greatest country in the history of the world because of freedom. And even though sometimes I worry about our freedom or I worry about the growth and the size and scope of government, I always think that bright young people like you have a chance to get it right and to correct any things that old codgers like me maybe screwed up. But the thing that you need to understand is twofold with the question. One, we've had a $35.7 trillion national debt, and it's growing. And you folks are being burdened with an unfair and disproportionate amount of that, in my opinion. And so all of these programs, whether it be the roads, whether it be these subsidies, when you look at electric vehicles, you take away the $7,500 direct subsidy to purchase an EV, and then you take away the subsidies to the companies to convert, we're talking electric vehicles being 50 or 60% higher than an ICE engine. And why should you folks be paying for that and paying for it over the long term? Now, I'll say to you, a great topic for a program like, or a seminar like the Freedom Seminar. Most people don't realize that most of the roads in the early days of this country were private profit-seeking entrepreneurs building roads. Most roads in America were private profit-seeking seekers built roads. And whether you realize it or not, 4 of the 5 arteries of the New York City subway system, if you've ever been on the New York City subway system, odds are you were on one of the 4 out of the 5 arteries that was built by private profit-seeking entrepreneurs. And then when they wanted to raise their price because of government regulations or inflation, the government then said, oh, we're not going to let you do it, bankrupted them, and then took them over. But there's also the option and opportunity to build new roads and to have them profit-seeking toll roads. If government can run a toll road, why can't a private company run a toll road? And in fact, a couple of roads initially were going to be built in Texas. I think there was one from Houston to San Antonio. They had a bunch of entrepreneurs wanted to get together and build the road. So there are a lot of interesting things that can happen. And then even maintaining roads, with all of these cameras and these electronic swiping systems, you get every month your bill for using roads comes in, and they could all be privatized. They could all be privately maintained. And I would suggest to you the roads would be better, they'd be more efficient, and there'd be less of the negatives and a whole list of the positives that we haven't even thought about. So that may be a little bit off base, but I would say take a look at that as well. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
Oh, building right off of that, do you think, it takes a really long time for them to finish construction projects. Do you think that we really have the capability to make changes like that in a quick amount of time?
Okay, for people listening, streaming, the question was, do we really believe that this can happen that quickly, given the time that it takes to build infrastructure today? So to that, I would point out major infrastructure projects like the Hoover Dam and others that were built back in the early 1900s, even 1800s, were built in a matter of 4 to 6 months. We absolutely can build those sorts of things. One example, different paper, but one of my colleagues at the Mackinac Center and I were looking at what it takes to get nuclear plants built. Okay, today they just built, it was Southern Company that was building, I think, but they got the Boreal plant in South Carolina and Georgia built. It took almost a decade and close to $30 billion to get it built. Okay, in South Korea, they can build the same plant for about $5 billion. So our problem is not that we lack the technology or the will or any of those sorts of things. Think of buildings like, in New York. Any of those big skyscrapers, they were built in years, in a year or less than a year. Our big problem is extreme regulatory pressure, especially in cases like the nuclear industry, and then also the litigious nature of different groups. So for the nuclear industry, essentially it's a well-known tactic of certain groups to just litigate everything. And what happens is basically the kind of behind the scenes talk is, if you can stretch out the project timeline long enough, the donors, the buyers lose interest, they go fund something else. So that's a well-known legal strategy. So it's not a matter of, do we have the technology, will, or capability to do this quickly? Yes, we do. We just have allow other things to get in the way.
The other point that I would make, and I think it gets to the underlying message in your question, that would be that when you look at roads and you look at new ideas, new ways of producing things. I remember, I'm trying to think of the person's name. He wrote for the Detroit News. It's terrible that I can't remember his name. But he pointed out in the United States, there was technology that was coming out of the civil engineering schools at American universities. And what he pointed out was that if you took roads and then you decided that you have a lot of problems, how could you handle multiple problems by combining a bunch of different variables? So long story short, this person was meeting with an engineer, professor of civil engineering, and he pointed out that in Europe, they were taking tires and they were grinding tires into small little pellets, and they were putting the pellets in with the hot blacktop, right? And so this was kind of a gooier blacktop. But what they found out was now the roads much more readily expanded during the summer without cracking or breaking because of the rubberization. And then in the winter, when they came back together, they didn't break up from the cold either. And so roads were lasting 30% longer just by adding the rubber pellets to the blacktop. And it was invented in the US. We weren't using it because of regulations. Some people say planned obsolescence. So we built new roads every 25 years instead of every, say, maybe 35 or 40. But the other point that was what was not being paid close attention to was we had a huge problem trying to get rid of all these old tires and these junkyards where water was gathering in the summer inside the tires, and we had problems with mosquitoes, etc. All that was going away because we were shipping used tires to Europe to make the specialized blacktop for the road. So I just think the market, with bright young minds like yours, the entrepreneurial process, Adam Smith's invisible hand in action, is just unbeatable to solve these problems.
Do you think the upkeep on like a gas car compared to an electric car is it really pretty similar, or is one like a lot more expensive or like cheaper? Like oil changes and like that kind of thing, or like if you need a new battery and stuff. Like which one is it like the same or are they different?
Right, so the question's asking upkeep and maintenance, what's the difference between an ICE vehicle and an EV? And so EVs definitely require less regular maintenance. They don't do oil changes. Obviously, they don't have those kind of expenses. But what they're finding, however, and the Hertz story is that Tim started to talk about, Hertz Rental, found that while you may not do as many of those kind of services, when you do a service, it's far more expensive on an EV. And so what they're finding actually is that EVs were more expensive to own and operate. And so you'll find, as you look into this issue, you'll find real experts on this. Some will say, no, EVs are much less expensive. But if you look at the businesses that are actually trying to make it happen, Hertz just sold off at the start of the year. It was 20%. I'm forgetting numbers. It was like 25 or 40,000 vehicles. They just said, we can't afford to operate these. Not only do people not want them, but they're too expensive to maintain. So in real life, they're finding that EVs, when they require the maintenance, are much more expensive.
Giving a pat on the back to electric vehicles, and yet at the same time, it's going to be a source of job loss here in Michigan, the Midwest, and the U.S. But the fact of the matter is, when they work well, to Jason's point, one of the main reasons why an electric vehicle is a lot more efficient and is much less troublesome if it operates well is because it has about 35 to 40, depending on the vehicle, % fewer moving parts on the electric vehicle versus the ICE engine. So there's a lot of parts that can go wrong. There's a lot of parts that need to be replaced. On the other side of the coin, the factories making those parts, the people employed making those parts, are very quickly being put out of work. And those towns, those tax bases are certainly negatively impacted by less production in ICE vehicles. And again, as a free market economist, I'm not against that. I'm just saying that the market determine the time and the process by which, if it happens, the electric vehicle and ICE and electric engines rises to a great degree and ICE engines decline. Let's not try to do it almost cold turkey like we're doing with the government making the decision rather than the market making the decision. Yes.
I was wondering if you guys could share your thoughts on how they are harvesting the energy for these EV chargers. Because like you stated in your presentation, renewable energy is only gathering 9% of our demands.
So you're asking how they're powering? Like what is the power supply going in?
Yeah.
Okay, I've got an amusing video in one of my other presentations. There's a GM executive that is asked by a media member, what's powering these vehicles? And she goes, oh, well, Lansing provides power to the building, right? And the media guy's like, yeah, okay, give me the rest. And her response is, well, I think there's a little coal. Well, maybe they're heavy on natural gas, right? Okay, so if you look at that graph that I put in my presentation, 91% of our energy is coming from either fossil fuels or nuclear. So the majority of what we're using to power our EVs right now is still fossil fuels. So now that graph is primary energy demand. So it includes heating fuels, transportation fuels, and all that sort of thing. Our electric demand, probably about 10 to 12% comes from wind and solar. So maybe it's a little bit higher, but still the vast majority of our electricity, and that's true around the planet, especially if you look in places like China. China is 65, 70% powered by coal. So yes, they're producing more EVs, but yeah, so at the end of the day, still, if you do an apples to apples comparison, it's about, depending on the energy mix, it takes between 3 to 5 years to kind of even out the CO2, embedded CO2 that goes into the manufacturing of an EV and the battery and that sort of thing. There's a much higher CO2, embedded CO2 component in an EV initially. But then depending on your energy mix, depending on how much you drive, that sort of thing, 3 to 5 years, it kind of evens out. And then ICE engines produce more emissions after that. So, but again, like I said, depends on your mix. And in the US, most of our electric energy still comes from fossil fuels.
So I've been reading how the Inflation Reduction Act, although initially resisted by some of the fossil fuel industry, is now being put on Trump to maintain many of its key features because these companies made investments in carbon capture and other very expensive capital intensive investments. So to what extent is this path we've begun built in, irreversible? Does it have momentum of its own? Whether it makes sense or not, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But is it actually something that you can change in midstream?
Yeah, so the question is, how long-term is the spending that's been embedded in legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act? Is it possible to actually reverse this spending? And so to answer that question, one of the greatest, well, probably the greatest president who ever lived, there is nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. Ronald Reagan. Yes, once any of those kind of situations, once people get a taste, basically, it's very difficult to get companies off of that. There was an article in, I believe it was Detroit News or maybe it was Bridge today, that basically made this exact argument that, well, Michigan would lose so much of this Inflation Reduction Act investment if we allow a new administration to come in and reduce this spending. Okay, well, that's always been the case. Any rent-seeking business is always more interested in continuing to rent seek. But it doesn't make it a good free market option. So if we're actually worried about free markets working, most of these investments are driven, as Tim has already said, they're driven by policy, not the market. So it's government making these investments. And just because we've made a bad decision doesn't mean we should continue to make bad decisions. We should stop making those bad decisions. So yes, it's going to be difficult to break that habit. But I mean, it's the same in any bad habit. If you drink too much, you should still break that bad habit. If you take drugs, you should break that bad habit. If you rely on handouts and subsidies to make your bottom line pencil out, you should break that bad habit.
I would simply add, when you look at a situation like this, it's the problem why government should be limited, why our founders said government should be as limited as possible, and in the areas that we need government as strong as possible. And if you go back and look at year 1900, government consumed less than 10% of our entire GDP. Local, state, and federal is about 7.8%. And the vast majority of that was at the local and the state level because government's not capable of making these decisions and making these decisions well. And I would just ask the question, what would America be like today if all of those horse and buggy manufacturers, all those buggy whip manufacturers had held the day? Because if you go back and do research, they were all talking about how terrible it would be to replace the horse and buggy. Look at all the horse farms that would be out of business, the horse breeders, the buggy manufacturers. And in 1908, there were a total of 8,000 automobiles in the United States when Henry Ford introduced the Model T. There were 144 miles of paved road, and the speed limit, the maximum you could travel, was 8 or 10 miles an hour on New York City roads. I don't know what kind of speedometer or a radar they used at the time, but life, the pace of life was dramatically different. Today, there are 296 million automobiles, light trucks, and SUVs on America's roads. An automobile cost almost 2 years' wages. The average person couldn't dream of owning even a Model T in 1908. Today, you can buy a number of highly productive vehicles that have options that were only dreamed of in 1908 today for less than half of the average wage of an American. So we've made tremendous progress because we were willing to say, hey, against all odds, against all the power brokers, the horse farms, the carriage manufacturers, the buggy manufacturers, the buggy whip industry, we told them all, hey, we're going to bet on this dream. And we're not saying that we're going to give them any subsidies, but we're saying we're going to let them compete. And I think that that's why America is great, because more than most countries of the world, we allow the market to decide things. And Dr. Mackinac told us that we had to make certain that we were done by 7:15. So if you have any more questions, come on up. And I wanted to leave you with this. Any of you really bright students that would like to do maybe a little research or writing here in the Mackinac Center, for a few shekels, emphasis on a few shekels, get your name in print, come on and see me. All right? Thank you for being here. Much appreciated.
Thank you both. And thank you all for joining us. Obviously,